part one of ADEIL's discussion with Neil Mosley, we talked about the value of sound justification, representing the design of a course, collaboration, and creating the conditions for learning. As our discussion continued, we discussed Neil's musical background, along with thoughts on online learning with the humanities and more thoughts on teaching and learning.
Now, if I may go on just a little bit of a tangent. So I read that you've been active as a musician, and I started as a musician. That's kind of what brought me to education. If you don't mind going on a tangent, could you tell me about one of a favorite or a memorable music experience that you've had?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've kind of so in my background, my undergraduate was in jazz, so played a lot of jazz. What seems like a long time ago now from when I was studying. But yeah, I've done lots of interesting gigs. I remember doing a gig on an amazing yacht that was moored off the coast of the Amalfi Coast in Italy. So I've kind of done these amazing experiences in terms of kind of the location of where you were playing, and I played at the Royal Albert Hall in London. But I would say the kind of best experience was probably when I was studying. So I was in a small jazz trio with two really good friends playing probably the more kind of contemporary style of jazz, and we never played anywhere particularly grand. We would play lots of kind of jazz clubs and jazz venues, but I think what was kind of magical about it was just that you were there with friends who had a similar sort of philosophy on music, similar musical interests. You enjoyed spending time with them. You really enjoyed the music, and you were really invested in the music. And jazz is just a great music form to perform. And so, you know, having gone from the grandness of something like the Royal Albert Hall, I almost think the most enjoyable music experience was playing with that trio in the small jazz clubs that we played in. Those, you know, because you have also a captive audience for that kind of music in those as well. So the kind of small intimate venues with playing with friends, playing great music, those were the kind of enjoyable things for me, I think.
Yeah. What's your instrument?
I play bass guitar, electric bass.
No, I know. A fellow bass player.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Who knew?
Yeah, no, it's a small world.
It was meant to be, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
we just find one another, don't we?
Yeah. Kindred spirits from across the Atlantic. Absolutely. I love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah. Yeah. Going back to the teaching and learning world, but also with a connection to the arts. So you recently wrote in your article, what does a turbulent present mean for the future of online education? And you write about the large, for programs that are interested in pursuing the online space, you've written about the large amount of, pre-existing programs that already exist, often with a focus on business or healthcare or technology, something that's more tangibly marketable, perhaps. There isn't necessarily the same emphasis on the humanities, on the arts. At the same time, though, the fields like the humanities or the arts, they're so prominently featured in online learning platforms that exist, like Masterclass. Or I think about YouTube, especially back with music. There are people doing phenomenal things with music and learning, and it's available for free. So let's say that you have a school that's approaching starting an online program, particularly in the humanities. How do they set themselves apart, given that there's so much stuff already out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's sort of interesting. I think this gets into heart of an interesting question, which is the extent to which kind of online content or learning experience that are maybe more at a kind of maker sort of level compete with a sort of qualification or committing to a longer term educational experience. So I'm not sure that it is a competition in a way, because I think committing to study at, say, a university or a conservatoire or a music college, I think is slightly different. And there's the lure of the qualification, but I think as well, I think one of the aspects that I was trying to get to at that article, which I think applies for anyone thinking about it in terms of the humanities thing, is that, you know, online education is becoming more and more of a crowded field. And, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, you now need to think about is how you're going to differentiate yourself in that field. You know, that's something that's really, really important. You know, what we've seen is people making moves, and they've been developing programs in areas where they know there's kind of a viability for them to get enrollments, and that's been those those areas, that you mentioned. And so, you know, I think there is more and more credibility and efficacy for online as a form of studying. So I think on that basis, you know, there is more potential for exploring maybe different subject areas. But I think, you know, whoever's going into online education now, you need to think carefully about what differentiates you, where you add value, what your identity is online. And I would say that for anybody, whether you're offering a kind of MBA, one of the many, many MBAs, or whether you're kind of offering an arts degree. But I think the arts kind of world is a really, really interesting space. I've been working with a number of kind of arts organizations in the past year or so, and kind of in art and drawing and music. And I think, you know, I think we might start to see some kind of innovations in that field as people go online. I mean, I think one of the key differentiating factors for those kinds of programs against kind of more traditional programs is that, you know, the synchronous, the live is really, really important. Whereas, you know, perhaps the orthodoxy in online education for a while has been, you know, don't do a lot of live synchronous stuff. It's all about asynchronous, that kind of slow kind of pace and the kind of flexibility that it offers. But, you know, I think it's just interesting that often in the arts and music that kind of cuts across there. But I think particularly, you know, if we kind of think about the music side of things, you know, those kinds of institutions are often quite elite and exclusive. And quite prestigious. You know, they're not kind of huge organizations that attract lots of students. And so, you know, giving people the access to some part of that experience through online education, I think is really, really powerful, because, you know, there are plenty of people who have music as a hobby, and to get the opportunity to study at a college, a prestigious music college, and to study with prestigious music faculty. I think one of the interesting things about some of the arts stuff is that certainly in the UK, if you were to look at maybe a business type degree, the professor wouldn't necessarily be that prominent. The faculty that teach on that wouldn't be that prominent. It's more about the university. Whereas in a music college setting, actually the people that you are taught by, you really want to kind of know about that. And so, so I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, there is a real power in those kinds of environments of giving people who wouldn't ever come to study with you for a whole range of different reasons access to that experience through online education. So I think that's a really, really powerful aspect of, you know, particularly the arts and online education. And I think, you know, I think one place that has done this really, really well, and I'm working with a music college at the moment, so this is very much on my mind. But, you know, Berkeley, I think, is a great example in the US of an institution that's, you know, done some really good things in online education over a number of years, really, in terms of, you know, seem from what I can see, really sound principles, you know, small groups, regular assignments, regular live sessions. There's real emphasis on community in that kind of environment. And, you know, I think from what I can see, people just really value being able to access an education at somewhere like Berkeley because they would never be able to go there. Maybe they're not proficient enough, or just the whole, you know, life gets in the way in lots of different ways. So I think, you know, arts institutions do have something to offer in the online space. I think giving people who wouldn't ordinarily have access to them is a really, really big part. But I think, you know, whether it's humanities or whether it's business or healthcare or, you know, whatever it might be, digital, I think if you're not thinking about what differentiates you what value you bring to this space in online education, then you're going to find it more and more challenging in a domain where there's just more and more and more. And as you rightly pointed out, it's not just more and more from universities, it's from the master classes or the Udacities or the kind of, all of these kind of organizations. And then even you have that even down to the organic level of, I go and put out a course or someone else puts out a course. So, there's a lot more out there. But I think I'm really interested in how things will develop with arts institutions, because I think, again, they're starting to make moves into that kind of domain. And I'm interested to see what pedagogies and approaches come out of that, as well as kind of what opportunities come out of that as well.
Now, here's a pretty wide open question. What excites you about distance learning moving forward?
That's a very good question. I think, I think I maybe touched on this a little bit already, but I think what's interesting is that, as I sort of said in the article, online education has tended to, certainly in the UK, focused around a particular range of disciplines. And I'm really interested in seeing what comes out of other disciplines that are taught in a completely different way, with a completely different underpinning, coming into this space and seeing what they do. The technology is always a kind of interesting aspect of it as well. So one thing I'm going to be working on later this year is this idea of the kind of discussion boards. And so, the discussion board is a big mainstay, isn't it, of kind of online programs. And so I think I'm interested in, how that will develop. We have a very sort of established threaded kind of discussion board, but technology is kind of moving on in terms of that side of things. And so you see technologies like, I think Packback is one where, there's a kind of an AI tutor that helps to try to encourage you to, present a more rigorous response. You have specific kind of communication technology. So I think Kialo is one where it's a debating tool. So I think, obviously that kind of mainly text-based interaction is such a big feature of particularly asynchronous online learning. So I'm really interested in, all of the different technologies that are kind of enhancing and creating different opportunities for that, whether it's the kind of web annotation stuff, whether it's the kind of technologies that wrap around content. You might be reading a particular chapter and you can dive in on that, or even video commenting. I'm interested in and excited about how that type of thing will evolve, and how we might have better means for interaction between students, interaction with content, interaction with a kind of instructor or educator. So I think, that communication component is so critical for every educational experience. And, as that develops, I think there'll be some really interesting opportunities for enhancements and for developments in online education. So that's kind of, I suppose, two areas: seeing what other disciplines that haven't traditionally moved into online education do, and how they kind of evolve it, how they push it, and is really, really interesting in how that kind of discussion kind of aspect and interaction aspect develops as the technology improves and moves on.
So Neil, what can people do to support your work?
Good question. Yeah, so I mean, I'm pretty active online. So I'm on Twitter, which my handle's at Neil Mosley 5, and I'm kind of sort of actively engaged on there. I share a whole bunch of different stuff, usually every day, of interest in the kind of broad field of learning and online and digital. So yeah, you can connect with me, and there I'm kind of equally active on LinkedIn as well. Just kind of managing to work on two platforms at the moment. I've not kind of expanded out into the big wide world of the Instagrams and the TikToks and things like that. But you can find me on those two. And I also have a website, which is neilmosley.com. And I really enjoy writing. So I have a have a blog, and I write relatively regularly, and so you can kind of check that out on my website. And I think you can also kind of sign up and get emailed whenever I kind of post something new. So those are the 3 ways in which you might want to engage with me and support my work. That would be great.
Thank you, Neil. I just want to share one story of an article you wrote. You made the point, and I actually used this in my own work. It was about program level design. I admittedly adapted it for a one-on-one with instructor, but it was about writing learning objectives. And yes, there are great principles we can keep in mind about, writing a really good learning objective. But sometimes just starting with, let's just not worry about how pretty it sounds. Just write something, get the big ideas down. We can always refine, we can always wordsmith, but that came in really handy with some recent consults I was doing. Just starting with those big ideas, and we can always reframe how those look like. So thank you, Neil, for your insights and your ideas and your writings.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Our interview concludes with Neil's encouragement for people working in teaching and learning.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of it is just to not beat yourself up about it. Like that. We're talking about an incredibly complex area because it involves human beings, and human beings are very different and have lots of other stuff going on. And so there is an element in which there's only so much that's within your sphere of influence as a teacher and an educator, and what's beholden to you is to do your best and to learn and develop, and none of us are the kind of finished article and are going to create the perfect course where everything just happens brilliantly and the students are just on it all the time. Like, we're always kind of striving to do the best for our students and create the best educational experience, and we won't always get it right, and not all of that's within our control. So I think there's also an element of being forgiving on oneself in these situations as well, if things aren't quite going as planned, and just taking that as an opportunity to learn and to reflect and think and maybe talk to people and get their take on things, and and go on, really.